High warriors of the fall and rise. Have you ever felt the sky fall? Not above you, but inside you? That kind of collapse where your chest tightens, not from fear, but from watching everything you built turn to dust in front of your eyes? Let's begin the story. Part 1. When the storm hits. Jay Carter wasn't just another dreamer. He was a builder, the kind who didn't just fantasize under the stars, but climbed through storms to touch them. A self-taught coder, entrepreneur by grit, and visionary by instinct. His startup had begun in a cramped basement with nothing but a second-hand laptop and an internet connection that cut out every few hours. But he had clarity, and more than that, he had hunger. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Meals were skipped, relationships strained. But he had a vision of a world he could help shape, and he pursued it like a man on fire. The impossible started becoming possible. Investors began to lean in. Tech blogs started featuring him. His name started buzzing in closed-door VC meetings. And just when it seemed like Jay had outrun the struggle, when the chaos turned into applause, the storm hit. It wasn't just betrayal. It was betrayal with a knife so sharp, he didn't feel the blood until he was already drowning in it. His co-founder, the man who once shared late-night noodles and big dreams with him, had been cooking something else in the background. A silent exit strategy, one that siphoned off funds, poisoned investor trust, and left Jay exposed. In a matter of weeks, the empire he built with his bare hands started to crumble. Lawsuits landed like grenades. His bank accounts froze. The media that once called him the next tech visionary now whispered words like fraud and failure. Social media turned cold. His phone, once flooded with congratulations, went hauntingly silent. Jay didn't lose just a company. He lost everything. And on that morning, standing alone in the skeleton of what was once his dream, cables hanging from the walls, dust dancing in empty light, Jay Carter felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Defeat. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just whispered, to no one in particular, "Is this the end?" And then, like thunder rolling after silence, something deep inside him, something unshakable, growled back. The comeback is always greater than the setback. That voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It didn't sound heroic or polished. It sounded raw, bruised, scarred, but it held something he hadn't felt in weeks: power. Because here's the truth nobody tells you. Sometimes you have to lose yourself completely to find the part of you they can never take. Jay didn't know what came next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't how his story would end. Failure didn't scare him anymore. Now it fed him. He walked out of that building, not with a plan, not with hope, but with rage. Not the kind that burns bridges, but the kind that builds armies. He realized the world didn't owe him a second chance. He would have to take it, rip it from the jaws of everything that tried to bury him. The same people who clapped at his rise were now betting on his fall. And Jay was done playing nice. Rock bottom, he would later say, isn't a curse, it's a damn launch pad. His eyes weren't filled with tears anymore. They were filled with fire. Because sometimes when everything is stripped away, your money, your friends, your reputation, what you're left with is your true identity. And Jay was finally meeting his. He wasn't the polished CEO with a perfect pitch deck. He was the survivor of sabotage, the architect of resilience, and the kind of fighter who doesn't ask the world for mercy. He demands respect. That day, walking out of the ruins, he didn't carry his past. He dragged it behind him like a chain he'd one day melt down and turn into armor. And with every step he took, one line kept echoing louder and louder in his soul. The comeback is always greater than the setback. Not just a quote now, not a mantra, not a lie to soothe the pain, but a promise. Ruin is the road to transformation. Elizabeth Gilbert. Part 2. The Valley of Shadows. Jay fell. Not the dramatic fall they show in movies. The kind with slow-motion music and a clear bottom. No, this was different. This fall had no floor. No lights. No rescue rope. Just darkness. He spiraled into the deepest valley his mind had ever known. And it wasn't filled with rage or fire. It was colder than that. It was filled with silence, self-doubt, and the slow, creeping weight of something people hate to admit they carry: depression. There were days Jay didn't get out of bed. Mornings when he stared at the ceiling, willing it to crash down and end the shame of existing. Nights where sleep was impossible, and thoughts screamed louder than any alarm clock. Every voice that had once said, "You're brilliant," had vanished. Now, his mind echoed with, "You're a failure. You were never good enough." They were right about you. And still, the world moved on. And Jay moved back home, back to the place he once dreamed of escaping, his mother's house. The same narrow room with the same faded posters and creaky ceiling fan that buzzed louder than his own will to start over. He unpacked not just clothes, but broken pride. Is there anything more humbling than returning to the very room where you first dreamed of making it big, only to come back in pieces? Sometimes, he thought, to rise again, you don't just fall, you kneel. His mother didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her quiet glances said everything. Love, worry, pain, but never pity. She gave him space, and in that silence, he met himself again. Weeks passed. The outside world forgot about Jay Carter, but inside him, something began to flicker. One evening, as he laid flat on that old mattress, staring at the crack in the ceiling, the same one that had been there since he was 14, a thought rose from the ashes. Not loud, not confident, just a whisper. What if this isn't the end? What if this is just the plot twist? It was absurd, almost laughable, but absurdity is where rebirth often begins. Jay sat up. He pulled out an old notebook from the drawer. The pages smelled of dust and hope. He didn't plan a company. He didn't map out an empire. He just wrote thoughts, fragments, dreams, regrets, what ifs, what nows. The pen didn't just scratch paper. It scratched the surface of a heart that had gone numb. He poured the poison out, word by word, and it felt like breathing for the first time in months. That night he slept, truly slept. The next morning, he did something unexpected, something small but powerful. He walked to a local community coding center, a tiny space where kids with nothing but curiosity came to learn. Jay asked if he could volunteer. The woman at the desk blinked at him. She didn't recognize him. That felt new, refreshing. She handed him a clipboard. No questions asked. He didn't bring up his past. No one knew about the $1 million startup. No one cared about the lawsuits or betrayal. Here, he was just Mr. J, the guy who helped kids figure out how to fix broken code. And slowly, silently, something inside him shifted. Every time a kid smiled after getting a program to run, every time someone said, Oh, I get it now. Every time he saw their eyes light up with the same hunger he once had. A piece of his soul healed. You don't rebuild yourself by chasing what broke you, Jay later wrote in his notebook. You rebuild by giving what you never had when you were breaking. He didn't need applause anymore, or headlines, or venture capital. He needed meaning. And in that dusty classroom, surrounded by cracked keyboards and squeaky chairs, he found it. Teaching them reminded him of who he was before the success, before the chaos, before the world had told him what he should be. Now, every day he volunteered, he grew quieter but sharper, like a sword being reforged in silence. He started reading again, meditating, running in the early mornings, not to chase a goal, just to breathe. He was still scarred, still rebuilding, but now he wasn't broken. He was becoming. Jay no longer wanted revenge. He wanted resurrection. Because what most people don't realize is, your greatest version isn't born from success. It's carved from survival. And Jay was surviving, slowly, powerfully, quietly. In a valley of shadows, he wasn't just recovering. He was rising. And though the world hadn't noticed yet, he had already started writing the first lines of his comeback. You don't drown by falling in the water. You drown by staying there. Edwin Lewis Cole. Part 3. The Rise of the Relentless. One of those students, a quiet 12-year-old with big eyes and untied shoelaces, waited behind after class one day. Her name was Myra. She looked up at Jay, confused, curious, and completely unfiltered. "Why do you teach us?" she asked, "when you could be rich somewhere else?" The question stopped Jay cold. For a second, he didn't know what to say. He smiled, that kind of smile you give when the truth is too heavy to share. Myra had no idea that this man in front of her had once sat at conference tables worth millions, that he had been shattered by betrayal, that teaching her how to write code was the first time in a long time he felt human again. He patted her shoulder and said, "Because you remind me why I started in the first place." But after she left, her question kept echoing like a drumbeat in his head. Why do you still show up? And somewhere in that echo, he found the answer. Because I'm not done. Jay didn't want revenge. He didn't want headlines. He wanted impact. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He was chasing meaning, the kind of meaning that didn't need applause, just action. Purpose, he wrote in his notebook that night, isn't about being noticed. It's about never being forgotten by the ones who matter. So, he started again, not with investors, not with a grand launch, but with borrowed tools, cheap coffee, and midnight determination. He coded from a second-hand laptop that overheated every 2 hours. He slept on the floor with post-it notes stuck to his forehead. He had no budget, no PR team, no hype. But he had one unstoppable thing: relentless drive. The idea? An app that would connect kids like Myra to mentors in the tech world. People who could guide them, uplift them, and give them what Jay never had when he first started: access. He called it SparkBridge because it wasn't just an app. It was a tribute, a bridge built from the spark Myra had reignited in his soul. It was messy at first, buggy, ugly interface, crashes everywhere. But it worked, and more than that, it mattered. Jay pitched the idea at local events. He stood in front of small audiences of bored investors, half listening and half emailing. He was rejected, brutally, again and again and again. "You're not credible anymore. This idea is too soft. You don't have the team or the traction. Each no was a blade, sharp and familiar. But this time, Jay didn't bleed. He burned, because every rejection reminded him. They didn't know what it meant to lose everything and still wake up every morning with your fists clenched and your heart on fire. They don't see the war you fought, he told himself, so they don't get to define your worth. He refined his pitch, improved the code, fixed the bugs, tightened the UX, wrote better copy, made videos, recorded testimonials from the kids he was already helping. One of those testimonials came from Myra herself. "My name is Myra," she said in the video, "and I didn't think someone like me could do tech stuff. Mr. J made me believe I could." Jay watched that clip alone one night, his laptop on 5% battery, his heart on 100% pride. He knew what Sparkbridge could become, and he knew the road would be hell, but he was ready for it. Because the difference between who he was before and who he was now, before, he was trying to build a business. Now, he was trying to build a legacy. And legacies aren't handed to you. They're forged in quiet nights, in failed attempts, in burned bridges that you cross anyway. He kept showing up, even when no one clapped, even when they rolled their eyes, even when they said, "It's cute, but not scalable." Even when they smiled and said, "We'll let you know," and never did. Jay didn't stop, because this wasn't about getting back to the top. It was about climbing higher than he'd ever been, on his own terms. Obstacles, he once wrote, are just brutal invitations to greatness, and he was done declining them. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. Winston Churchill. Part 4, blood, sweat, but no tears. The universe has a wicked sense of timing. Jay had pitched Sparkbridge so many times he could recite it in his sleep. But it wasn't at a tech conference, a pitch competition, or a polished demo day that everything changed. No. It happened in a dusty community center gym. Jay had volunteered to speak at a free tech awareness event. Low attendance, folding chairs, kids playing outside. Just another night in a long line of maybe one day efforts. He didn't even bring his full presentation. That's where David Klein was sitting. A quiet man in his late 60s, dressed in jeans and a worn hoodie, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Jay didn't know him. No one did. David didn't introduce himself as anyone important because he didn't need to. But behind those calm eyes was the mind that had once helped shape one of Silicon Valley's most iconic companies. And tonight, for reasons unknown, he stayed after the talk. He walked up to Jay and said simply, "This isn't an app. It's a revolution. Let me help." Jay blinked. "Help how?" David smiled. "With everything. No pitch deck. No credentials. Just vision, blood, and authenticity." That's what hooked David. And just like that, the wheels turned. Within weeks, Sparkbridge had structure. Not the kind built on fragile funding and hype, but on intention, integrity, and grit. David brought mentorship, connections, and strategy. Jay brought fire. Together, they didn't build a startup. They rebuilt a purpose. But it wasn't a Hollywood-style meteoric rise. It was slow, frustrating, humbling. The early team worked out of cafes, living rooms, and public libraries. Some nights, Jay slept in his car between meetings. He refused to pay himself until his first 5 interns got laptops. They ate discount noodles and celebrated milestones with gas station cupcakes. Success doesn't ask for permission, Jay scribbled in his journal. It demands sacrifice, and sometimes everything. Within a year, Sparkbridge had quietly infiltrated 18 cities. Schools and nonprofits signed on. Mentors signed up. Kids who had never touched a computer were building simple apps, sending emails to industry leaders, and speaking in tech they once thought was a foreign language. And then came the headlines. Not the flashy, shallow ones, but real, powerful stories written by journalists who did more than just Google his name. They didn't write about the million-dollar rise or the betrayal that wrecked him. They wrote about a man who taught in the ruins of his failure and lit a fire from the ashes. From broken to builder, the Jay Carter story. Sparkbridge founder turns pain into purpose. A startup that starts with a heart. He was once the face of collapse. Now, he was the symbol of resilience. People asked him at events, podcasts, interviews, "How did you keep going? What made you rise when most would have stayed down?" Jay never hesitated, because I realized he'd say, "My value didn't die when my dream did. It just evolved." He never tried to rewrite the past. He wore it like armor. The betrayal, the downfall, the humiliation, they didn't disappear. They were just repurposed. Every scar, a map of where not to step. Every loss, a new compass. Every rejection, a sharpened blade. He didn't walk into rooms like a polished CEO. He walked in like a warrior who'd bled for his mission. And people felt it. You can fake polish. You can fake success. But you can't fake the energy of someone who survived hell and still walks like they own the road. "Tears," Jay said in one interview. "I ran out of those 2 years ago. Now it's just blood and sweat, and that's enough." He wasn't trying to win over doubters anymore. He wasn't fighting ghosts. He was building louder, smarter, braver. And Myra? She was now speaking at national youth events, telling other girls from underrepresented backgrounds how Mr. J showed her that her voice mattered in tech, that her curiosity wasn't a weakness, it was her weapon. Jay watched her from the back row once, heart heavy with pride. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just smiled, because in her, in every Sparkbridge success story, he saw proof that the comeback had already begun, and it was bigger than anything he could have imagined. Your setback is just a setup for your greatest comeback. Part 5. The roar after the silence. Jay didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not after coming this far. Not after seeing what Sparkbridge was becoming. What began with borrowed gear and midnight hustle had now evolved into a living force, something bigger than him, something unstoppable, not a product, but a pulse. Sparkbridge was now reaching underserved schools in remote towns, refugee camps, and even correctional facilities. What started in a cramped room with flickering lights had found its way into places where hope had been forgotten. Jay, once written off, was now rewriting the rule book, not with capital, but with conviction. And then came Myra, not as a student anymore. At 16, she was fierce, focused, and filled with fire. Jay made her one of Sparkbridge's youngest board members, not out of sentiment, but out of strategy. She understood the struggle, and more importantly, she knew how to speak to the forgotten kids, the invisible ones, because she had once been one. She became a voice. Jay, he became the echo that carried it farther. Together, they visited schools where paint peeled off the walls, where kids sat on broken benches with working brains and empty bellies. They didn't bring pity, they brought possibilities. Jay would stand before those children and say, "If you're in your lowest valley right now, I've been there. I slept beside broken dreams. I watched everything I built turn to dust. But trust me, that valley isn't your final destination. It's just the tunnel before the dawn." He didn't preach success. He preached scars, because scars tell you where you've been, but not where you're stuck. The world started paying attention again. But this time, the headlines weren't about IPOs or funding rounds. They were about lives, about transformation, about how a man who once ruled tech's golden towers was now rebuilding from ground zero and bringing others with him. He was invited to speak at global forums. He turned some of them down. "If your stage doesn't include the people who need the solution most, I'm not interested," he told one organizer bluntly. That was Jay now, not hungry for applause, but allergic to compromise. He knew now that success without impact is hollow. Sparkbridge wasn't his redemption arc. It was a rebellion against everything fake he once believed about worth and status. And people noticed. Quietly, relentlessly, Sparkbridge spread. Universities wanted to partner. NGOs offered funding. A few investors even returned, the same ones who once ghosted him. But Jay didn't hand over the keys. This time he led on his terms. He refused vanity metrics. He focused on mentorship, mental health resources, real skills, and human-to-human connection. Because in those dark nights of rebuilding, Jay had realized something dangerous, something liberating. You don't need the world's permission to rise again. You just need to decide you're not done. And that's what Jay did, not just once, but every single day. He didn't wear his fall as shame. He wore it as armor. Soon, Sparkbridge wasn't just a nonprofit. It was a movement. It had chapters in 32 cities, a network of over 1,000 mentors, and more importantly, stories. Thousands of stories of kids who didn't just dream big. They learned how to build those dreams, brick by digital brick. Jay's story was now featured in a best-selling biography titled From Ashes to Architect. It didn't glorify his riches. It detailed the nights he nearly gave up, the coffee-stained notebooks, the apartment with no heat, the voice messages from his mom that kept him going. When he was asked in an interview, "How did you survive the silence? The months when nobody cared, nobody called?" He smiled, paused, and said, "Because silence is where you hear your true voice. And when you finally hear it, nothing and no one can drown it out." That's why the world fell in love with Jay again. Not for his comeback, but for his refusal to be silenced. And for those watching now, maybe from a cracked phone in a shared room, maybe during a lunch break they hate, Jay had one message. If today feels like defeat, good, that means your comeback is brewing. The pressure you're feeling? That's not punishment. That's life loading your next chapter. He often ended his talks by telling the crowd, "Remember this. Every champion was once a contender who refused to quit. Every flame you admire started with someone striking in the dark." Jay never asked to be admired. He asked people to remember that your lowest point isn't where your story ends. It's where your legend begins. Hard times may have held you down, but they will not last forever. When all is said and done, you'll be increased. Joel Osteen. And with that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.